You may note there is no jaunty music, no whimsical intro. I have actually declared this to be a minimum whimsy recording. For a very dire reason. I don't want to be any more absurd than I have ever been. Because all the absurdity has been taken up by the topic at hand. Intolerably absurd is it? Mostly because it's real. Not whimsy, not an SCP file, not some piece of misinformation. This is very much objectively real. Let's start with a question. What is torture? Would you call the application of pain to force a behavior torture? Would you call it punishment designed to force behavior or speech even that one wants? Typically that's its application in interrogation, which presumably some people say is a terrible thing that should never be done. So what if I told you that torture was regularly applied in the modern era, not by the government, not on terrorist suspects, but on children? And that it's been applying torture to children since, 1977 or so? That it is evidently that was in effect in 1985, that it's ongoing even now? Torture. And there's no other word for it. It's torture. Even now. At a place called the Judge Rotenberg Center. But let's not get ahead. Let's find out a little bit more about the Judge Rotenberg Center via its founder. Matthew Israel is an American behavioral psychologist who is known for founding the Judge Rotenberg Center and inventing the graduated electronic decelerator, which the aforementioned shock torture implement mentioned earlier. Oh, wait, before I carry on, I must interrupt myself to note, what is the graduated electronic decelerator? Well, the graduated electronic decelerator is the torture tool of choice by the JRC. Let's, again, forgive me, go back to Wikipedia for this point. This article is about the formerly banned aversive conditioning, aka torture device. For the use of electric shocks as a medical procedure, see electroconvulsive therapy. Notably, when they say stop the shock, a lot of people confuse that for electroconvulsive therapy, which leads them to being discredited later on. I don't like that, really. Doesn't really matter if it's electroconvulsive or not. It is really, really unacceptable because it is, make no mistake, not an aversive treatment conditioning tool. It's a torture instrument. The gradual electronic decelerator is an aversive conditioning torture device that delivers a powerful electric skin shock to punish behaviors considered undesirable. The GED was created by Dr. Hurt, Matthew Israel, for use on students at the Judge Rotenberg Center as part of the school's torture modification program. The school has since been condemned for torture by the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Torture on its use of the GED and other inhumane punishments. In 2020, the device was banned by the United States Food and Drug Administration. On July 6, 2021, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Court overturned the ruling, stating the ban was beyond the FDA's authority. But what about this overturning that allowed this torture tool to be reused? A federal appeals court has overturned the Food and Drug Administration's ban of the use of an electric shock device to correct aggressive or self-harming behavior in adults and children at a Massachusetts school for the developmentally disabled. In a 2-1 opinion, the U.S. Court of Appeal for the D.C. Circuit found the ban was regulation of the practice of medicine, which is beyond the FDA's authority. The two judges who overturned it said that making this a use-specific ban interferes with the practitioner's authority by restricting the available range of torture devices through regulatory action. The FDA has no authority to choose what medical devices a practitioner should prescribe or administer, or for which conditions, the judge wrote. Until was joined by Circuit Judge Gregory Katzass. The dissenting Chief Judge Sri Srinivasan dissented, again, writing that since the FDA could ban the device entirely and should have, it was hard to perceive why Congress would want to deny the agency that middle ground. The case is the Judge Rotenberg Educational Center, Inc. versus the FDA, D.C. Circuit U.S. Court of Appeals. So that's the GED, and it's back in use. That's the shock they want to stop, and it should never have been allowed to start in the first place. As a freshman in college, Israel read B.F. Skinner's novel, Walden 2, in which the heroes build a utopia by conditioning the residents of a commune through the behaviorist principles of reward and punishment. After reading the book, Israel devoted himself to making the utopia described in it reality. Israel said that the period between reading the book and his first attempts to start the utopia was a very difficult time in his life. "I thought about committing suicide," he said. "If I couldn't bring a community into existence, in what sense was life worth living?" Unfortunately, he survived. Israel went on to study behaviorism under B.F. Skinner and to receive his PhD from Harvard University in 1960. Now, this first bit is from Wikipedia, surely subject to change. I'm sure it may yet be sanitized. But for now, it gives you a good starting point. In 1950, Israel enrolled at Harvard University. In his freshman year, he took a class in behaviorism with B.F. Skinner to get a required science credit. During his time, he read Skinner's book, Walden 2, in which the heroes build a utopia by conditioning the residents of a commune the behaviorist principles of reward and punishment. Israel said that reading Walden 2 was like a religious conversion for him. So, in short, he came. After reading the book, he devoted himself to making the utopia described into reality. "I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to start a real utopian behavioral community." Matthew Israel. Before we get into his attempts at that, I would like to remind you that B.F. Skinner, who probably the most important thing he taught us is they can addict a pigeon to gambling, did not believe free will was a thing. He believed it was an illusion. And there's a certain concept that gets thrown out there that people who can't control themselves will need to control others. Mr. Skinner and Mr. Israel here believed that free will was an illusion, presumably, and thus had a need to control everyone else. If free will is an illusion, oh boy, is it one to embrace. Because the people who abandon it seem to be turning out a lot like this guy. Let's move on. Attempts to build a utopia. After graduating from Harvard in 1960, Israel started a firm for the design and marketing of B.F. Skinner's teaching machines. With the hope of raising enough capital to establish a community in the form of Walden 2, the firm was unsuccessful, and after several years, he closed it down and went on with his plans to build the community anyway. In 1966, Israel attended a Walden 2 conference where he shared ideas with other Walden 2 enthusiasts about how to start the behaviorist utopia. Israel created the Association of Social Design, ASD, an organization for people trying to create behaviorist communities on the principles laid out in Walden 2. Israel planned for the commune that they would create to be called Walden 3. In correspondence with a couple named Dan and Marnie who were interested in the project, Israel suggested that Marnie would be expected to have sex with him if they joined the commune. After a series of letters between Israel and Dan, in which Marnie's opinion on the matter was not at any point discussed, the couple decided not to join, to Dan's credit on that point at least. In 1967, Israel tried for the first time to build a utopian commune modeled after Walden 2 by starting a small communal house in Arlington. One resident at the Arlington house was a 3-year-old girl who was poorly behaved. The girl's mother agreed to let Israel try to modify behavior. He described the use of positive reinforcement, timeout, and physical punishment. Israel reports that he did not see significant changes in her behavior until he disciplined her with physical punishment in the form of a slap across the face. He also noticed that using physical punishment, he could make her stop crying. After working with her for some time, Israel reported that he could control the child's behavior with just a glance or a shake of the head. From that point on, Israel said, instead of being an annoyance, she became a charming addition, a charming individual to the house. And please do remember that story for later. It'll be important when we get to the softball interview Mother Jones gave him. After performing behavioral experiments on 6 autistic children at Bradley Hospital, Israel founded the Behavior Research Institute, which later changed its name to the Judge Rotenberg Center. Israel insisted that the first employees of the school had to be people interested in Walden 2. although he later had to drop that requirement to keep the institute well staffed. However, Israel reports that the school still shared many similarities with the town in Walden 2. Walden 2 was a comprehensive environment. The notion was that you needed to have the whole environment under control. With a school like this, we had an awful lot. Not the whole environment, but an awful lot. After a few years, he gave up on further attempts to build a utopian community because he was getting so much satisfaction from running the school. Furthermore, in his previous experiments of creating a utopian society, he ultimately gave up on that because, well, he didn't have enough control over the people. They could, leave. They weren't prisoners. And that's why he moved on to developmentally challenged students, because they would have fewer rights and protections. It was not his first. He didn't go into this looking to help anyone, except himself. In 1977, the California Department of Health rejected Israel's application for a license to operate a group home, citing lack of meaningful peer review and unnecessary use of painful aversives, also known as torture. The department also found that there was insufficient evidence to show that Israel was reputable and responsible, and that he had the ability to comply with regulations. Furthermore, the department found that Israel was unlawfully practicing psychology without a license in the state of California. Without a license to operate, the school was scheduled to be shut down, but the day after the scheduled shutdown, a group of parents reopened it as a co-op, moving Israel's official position to executive director to consultant. The school then applied for a license from the state of California to operate a group home and for a permit to use aversives. With the aid of then California Governor Pat Brown, whose law firm was hired to represent the school, they received the license, as well as the only permit ever granted by the state of California to use torture on its students. Following the death of a student and an investigation by the states of California, the institute was banned from using physical aversives, torture, as well as from using restraints and withholding meals as punishment in 1981. The institute soon after moved its main center of operation to Massachusetts. While corporal punishment was against the law in Massachusetts, the institute was granted special permission to use torture in 1983. The institute was welcomed by some state officials due to its near-zero rejection rate, as it was able and willing to take the state's most difficult students. No matter how big, how old, or how disgusting the student, we won't say no. Everyone's equal at the gallows. Well, that's enough of the wiki entry. I'm sure it'll be due to change, probably sanitized in some ways or another. Let's look at some other sources. See, this has been in operation for a very long time. In fact, we have an article from People in 1985. Some call it torture, but New England School says that its therapy is taming autistic students. Taming. Yeah, updated April 14th, 1996. Taming is not a word you use with people. Taming is a word you use with animals. And neither William Plummer, who wrote this, or whoever wrote that title, or the people who are subjecting their own children to this, clearly viewed them as human. This is from the 1985 article. There's a hierarchy of aversives, which again means torture, at BRI. For simply mumbling at the wrong time, a student may receive a token monetary fine or get misted with water from a bottle, again like you might with a dog. It's at this point that BRI starts to get in trouble with its critics. In addition to the white noise treatment, where they blast white noise into the ears of an autistic child, instructors apply what they call the automatic vapor spray, during which the student is forced to sit in a small booth, shackled in soft plastic cuffs, and wears a helmet that blasts them with white noise and sprays his face with cold water vapor. Often an ammonia pellet is shoved beneath his nostrils just before the 15-minute process begins in earnest. For these and other ingenious approaches, Israel was savaged by the Boston Phoenix, a weekly newspaper that referred to him as Dr. Hurt, an aptly termed title. He's running some flack from his colleagues as well. Robert Bowles, president of the National Society for Children with and Adults with Autism, thinks Israel means well, but finds his methods deplorable. What a fucking understatement. Some of the parents back then thought this was great. They defended themselves. BRI parents supposedly thought that Anne Donnellan and other critics were hysterics. And quote-unquote, "We're not horrible and sadistic," says Robert Flanagan of Port Washington, New York, former chairman of Western Union, whose severely autistic son Chris, 29, has been at BRI for 8 years. I wonder if he's still alive. I couldn't find any trace personally. Any parent who's ever punished his child has worried whether it's the right thing to do. We thought BRI's program might work when we sent Chris there, and we were right. Chris has been doing marvelously. We knew the only alternative to BRI was the state institutions, where Chris would be sodomized, beaten, and if he were lucky, held in a straitjacket. They're torture places. Few flaws in this logic. First off, there's another alternative. It's called caring for your own child at home. That's a pretty good option. But apparently you're fine with your child being tortured, objectively, clearly, no the definition works, tortured, but at least they're not doing butt stuff to him. I have an opinion that Robert Flanagan of Port Washington, New York, if he's still alive, should think very carefully on his post-existence. It doesn't look bright from my perspective. Note, the only alternative for Robert Flanagan of Port Washington, former chairman of Western Union, was this torture for his son, or he was going to put him in the other torture places, the state institution. And he tries to suggest that he's being a good dad. You remember the story earlier, perhaps, where Dr. Hurt got a chance to apply behavioral therapy to a 3-year-old that involved basically slapping them around until they're so terrified they did everything he even suggested he wanted? Well, he got interviewed by Mother Jones and had his own take on this, regarding one of his attempts at a utopian society. After he went back to graduate school to study under Skinner, which is what he then did, and at the time was working on his program instruction teaching machines, his first approach was to start a business to make program instruction teaching machines in the early 1960s, and that didn't work out. I'm sorry, wrong voice. I was hoping he would be so successful and support the utopian community. My next approach was I started 2 communal houses, hoping they would grow into a community. That didn't work out well. What were the houses? Well, one was in South End in Boston, one was in Arlington, and they just flopped. Well, they had all the problems for marriage without the satisfactions people have in marriage. All the problems of living together. It could be that some people refused to sleep with him on command, which was considered a satisfaction people have in marriage. But I can see why I wouldn't want to go into detail on that. How many people were in them? The first had 6 or 7 people. The second had 5. The first had a 3-year-old girl who had these terrible behaviors, screaming. She was very spoiled. Her mother was a Freudian. She was an unwed mother, but she gave me the chance to do training with her child. Her mother was a Freudian. And it's a 3-year-old. If a 3-year-old's behavior is bad, it's not the 3-year-old's fault. It's the parent. What did that entail? Again, remember the story from earlier? Well, the first thing was that she had to stop this. She was very wild and screaming. I had started a group called the Association of Social Design, people who wanted to work toward building a behavioral community. And at a party, she would walk around with a toy broom and whack people over the head. And they, of course, couldn't defend themselves or say no, because 3-year-olds are just that threatening. This was the Association of Social Design? Yeah, we'd have a meeting every 8 days, invite people, try to get people interested in a utopian community. That was when behavioral modification was beginning to. The first journals were in the 60s, and I remember at one point she would be screaming, and I would retreat to my own room, and she'd be trying to pull away and get into my room, and I'd have to hold the door on one side to keep her from disturbing me while I tried to talk to someone. When she was screaming one day, I asked her mother if I could try a few behavioral procedures, and her mother said, okay. I would reward her when she was quiet and not screaming, but that alone didn't seem to work sufficient. One day I found myself alone in the house with her, and she started to barge into my room when I was trying to work or something, and maybe she was screaming or whatever. I found myself putting her in her room and saying, there's no screaming, time out for you. Time out was a procedure that was being used in a lot of papers and literature. The idea was that you took away the opportunity for reward. It was time out from reinforcement. And she kept screaming, and that was annoying. And now she's trying to come out of the room, and I'm a 40-year-old in my late 30s holding the door on one side, and this little 3-year-old is on the other side, and I thought, this is ridiculous. I went into a room, I gave her a snap on the cheek and said, there's no screaming when you're in timeout. What is this, like a punishment? It's a snap on the cheek with a finger. Either a snap or a slap, I'm not sure which. And I went outside again. I would measure how long she was quiet, and I noticed I did this a couple of times, and she would stop her crying, and I would take walks with her. That was a source of a lot of reward. And it got to the point where she was so well-mannered that if I sat across the table from her and she started to do something inappropriate, I could just shake my hat at her like this, and she would, instead of being annoyance, she became a charming addition, a charming individual to the house, and I'd teach her how to play by herself. I'd say, You can play by yourself a while. I'd set a timer and I'd say, if you can play by yourself for 2 minutes, we'll do something fun. It was the same basic behavioral techniques. It was general property. It wasn't something I invented. It was obvious principles. So that was kind of an eye-opener to see how effective this was. Skinner's work was mostly with pigeons and rats, and he speculated the same principles would work with human organisms as well. Barely a distinction between them in his mind. And early in the 70s, 60s, and 80s, the people actually started to research with humans, at first with psychotic and retarded people, and then with normal, unimpaired individuals. What was the little girl's name? Andrea. And whatever happened to Andrea, I don't know. I would like to know. And so would I. So she was in some ways your first pupil. I don't know if pupil's the word. Yes, that's right. And there was a couple that joined the house at Summer Logic because they found her so charming. She could be a sweet, charming little girl. Often we have to slap her on the face. It was just a couple of times. I think I didn't use a slap. If I used it the first time, then I went to just a cheek snap. I would give her instructions to just follow directions. I'd say, Andrea, we're going to learn to follow directions. And I'd give her directions that weren't necessarily meaningful things. I'd say, touch the doorknob, please. And if she did, I'd pick her up and reward her extravagantly. And if she refused, I might give her a snap on the cheek. Skinner had not really been a proponent of punishment. His Walden 2 was a world where reward was used so skillfully you didn't ever need to punish. And he said of punishment that it works temporarily, but in the long run it has. He related a lot of the problems people had to punishment early in life. And that was a theme of the Freudian approach also. Anyway, to skip forward a bit, in the late 60s, I decided these two communal houses were in this. Sorry, it just struck me that reading this asshole's words is making me physically ill. If you're wondering, by the way, Lefty fans, why Mother Jones, the so-called premier source of revolution, was giving such a softball interview just as short ago a time as 2007, well, here's a clue. I got angry at myself at one point because I didn't seem to be reading anything except what professors were putting on their list of books you're supposed to read, so I said, let's pick up some books that aren't assigned to me, and Skinner had written a utopian novel called Walden 2, and that really captivated me because what he said in that book was something I alluded to yesterday. He said that a lot of the issues in the world have to do with what we understand to be the nature of man. Is he a free, rational person able to choose between good and evil, between truth and falsehood? And if so, John Mills and the democratic approach to government make a lot of sense. If he is primarily motivated by sexual issues, then the Freudian makes a lot of sense. If he is primarily motivated by position in the economic class struggle, then Marxism, communism makes sense. Marxism, communism has never made sense. It's never worked. But I think Mother Jones took this as enough of a sign that he's a comrade. The Judge Rotenberg Center, and I tried to find out who Judge Rotenberg is. I still don't know. I think if I were Judge Rotenberg, I would be very upset to have my name slapped onto a child torture facility. Apparently, whoever Judge Rotenberg is, they're not too bothered by that because they're not suing them. But did you know that the Judge Rotenberg Center has a Twitter? It does, at Judge RC. JRC is a day and residential school located in Canton, Massachusetts, licensed to serve ages 5 through adult. If you are inclined to look up their Twitter account, I should have to change it irregularly, you'll note something very, very disturbing. Nary a tweet doesn't end in an exclamation point, meaning that you get a lot of really creepy messages like this. Congratulations to Craig for graduating from occupational therapy! Happy birthday to these assorted names and clients celebrating this month! Happy faces around the JRC! Well, no fucking wonder. If you tell someone that they better smile and be convincing or you're going to shock the shit out of them, I'm sure after enough tries, they'll eventually get it right. This is, again, I just can't stress how deeply intolerable it is. There's some effort to fight this. There has apparently been some effort for some time, and the fact that this facility has been in operation since 1985 tells you that thus far it has been entirely insufficient. I have precisely one word of advice to the people arraying themselves against this. When they refer to this, they tend to refer to the whole autistic community, thus dividing themselves from humanity when they express their outrage at this. This is not a problem for the autistic community. This is a problem for any so-called civilized human society. This is a problem for humanity itself to solve. This is unacceptable in any context. You cannot slap a shock collar on a prisoner in America legally. You can't cram ammonia pellets up their nose and stick them in a torture cell. The worst thing at present you can do, as I understand it, is solitary. This is so much farther beyond that, and for what? To correct abnormal behavior. And more accurately, for the satisfaction of people who just really want that. Links will be in the description. I urge you to go through as many as you can stand. You can learn about action items put together by an autistic science person. You can learn about the documentation on what's been going on at the Judge Rotenberg Center. You can read the stories of survivors, and survivors are the word. And not everyone has survived, because in a rather unsurprising twist of events, it turns out that an awful lot of the students, the torture victims, while they might have gotten out and done reasonably well for a while, at the first mere idea they might be going back, tended to, well, suicide attempts. Can't say I blame them. At the very least, you could perhaps sign the petition. I don't think this is going to be sufficient opposition either. But one thing's for certain, this has gone on way, 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 way too long. I get accused of being a mad scientist regularly, and I object to that. I am not mad. I am increasingly angry. And then at this moment, I'm very angry. So much so that I really just don't know how to express it properly, but suffice to say, between this and sort of other things happening in Massachusetts, if I had the power, which I certainly don't, I'd be awfully tempted to wipe the state out of the Union and the planet just to be safe. I sure hope it wouldn't ever need to come to that. But I do hope everyone keeps a very close eye on Massachusetts, on Boston, and their incredibly loathsome approach and treatment of children. If you're in Massachusetts, well, get your kids out, at least. That about boils it down. Please do take a look at the links in the description. No outro, just if someone out there could make this center go away, that would be great. And if you should happen to be able to, oh, I don't know, flip the script, put all the graduated electronic decelerators on the staff instead of the students, and hand the controllers to the students, that would be fantastic, hilarious, and be great for viral videos. What a great twist that would be. Hilarious, I'm sure, and just. Absolutely just. Meanwhile, I understand Dr. Hurt is still alive, but he will have to die eventually. That's inevitable. And might I suggest that wherever he's buried, they go ahead and place the world's largest urinal just to make it easier for all the tourists that are sure to arrive. This is a straight-up torture implement by quite possibly some of the most evil people I think I've ever heard of existing in the US. I mean, pretty high up there. Child torture center. How do you get lower than that, really? Unless it's doubles as a butchering canning center as well.